The morning light crept gently through the sheer curtains of Grace Monroe's modest Portland apartment, casting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. The sound of children's laughter floated in through the open window, warm and distant like music from another life. Grace stood barefoot by the window, holding a chipped ceramic mug between her palms, watching her 4 children play in the park across the street. They tumbled over each other in piles of fallen leaves, shouting and chasing, lost in the kind of joy only children understand. A part of her smiled watching them, and yet something in her chest tightened. The quiet was dangerous. It allowed memory to rise uninvited. 1 year ago, almost to the day, she had sat across from Nathan Caldwell in a rooftop restaurant that overlooked the Portland skyline. It had been late, close to closing time, and she remembered the candlelight flickering against his untouched whiskey. He wouldn't meet her eyes. When he finally spoke, the words came sharp and cold, like metal against glass. "Grace, this isn't going to work. My family doesn't approve, and I have to think about the legacy, the company." She had laughed nervously at first, thinking it was some awful joke. But his face didn't move. "But I'm pregnant," she'd whispered, "with your children. 4 of them." He nodded stiffly. "I'll provide financial support, of course. But I can't. I can't be there. I'm not what they need." And with that, he stood, leaving her in a swirl of candlelight, silence, and everything that could have been. A car horn below snapped her out of it. She exhaled slowly and turned from the window. Her apartment was cluttered but clean, filled with drawings taped to the fridge and small, imperfect signs of a life in motion. The children would be out there for a while, and she had work to do. She passed through the narrow hallway into what used to be the dining area but had now become her makeshift studio. Fabric samples, pencil sketches, thread spools, and tea-stained inspiration boards covered the table and walls. A second-hand sewing machine sat in the corner, slightly tilted, a faithful companion through long, sleepless nights. After Nathan left, Grace hadn't cried for long. Crying didn't change diapers or pay rent. She dusted off her old design textbooks, started sketching again in the hours between feeding and rocking and folding laundry. What began as stolen moments of creativity had grown into the beginnings of something real. Her concept was clear: ethically made children's clothing, soft and sustainable, designed for comfort and play. She called it Earthward Threads, a name that felt rooted, calm, and hers. Every stitch was a tiny rebellion, a quiet way of reclaiming what had been taken. In the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and oversteeped coffee lingered. Her mother, Linda, stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal with a wooden spoon that had long since lost its varnish. She glanced over as Grace entered and slid a bowl across the counter. "Eat first. Think later," she said not unkindly. Grace smiled faintly and sat down. The silence between them was thick but companionable. Linda had moved in when the babies were born, saying nothing about Nathan, offering no judgment, only space and quiet strength. Grace respected her for that more than she could say. Between spoonfuls of oatmeal, they discussed the children's new routines, the rising cost of cotton, and the slow but steady growth of Grace's social media following. Linda listened more than she spoke, occasionally offering a comment that cut straight to the point. "You don't need to go big. You just need to go honest. That's what people are hungry for." Grace nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I just want to build something that matters," she said. "Something real. Something that doesn't depend on anyone else's last name." When breakfast was done and the bowls were in the sink, Grace returned to the studio and began sorting through her designs. A dozen baby rompers in soft earth tones. Tiny wooden buttons she'd found at a second-hand shop. As she adjusted a pattern on the mannequin, her phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it at first, thinking it was another automated notification. But the subject line caught her eye. Invitation to local eco-fashion market, Pearl Street. She opened the email, her hands suddenly still. The organizers had seen her work on Instagram and were inviting her to showcase her designs at the seasonal sustainability fair downtown. Booth provided, no fee. Grace stared at the screen, blinking. The words didn't quite register at first, but when they did, something swelled in her chest. Not fear. Not doubt. Something else. Maybe it was the beginning of belief. Maybe it was the first crack of light. The Pearl Street Eco Market was in full swing by noon, and the air buzzed with the scent of roasted coffee, beeswax candles, and the faint citrus of natural detergents being demonstrated by enthusiastic vendors. Grace Monroe stood under the canvas awning of her booth, surrounded by racks of baby rompers, toddler overalls, and soft tunics in earth tones. Her modest display table held neatly folded organic cotton sets, baskets of wooden buttons, and a small hand-lettered sign that read, Earthward threads, honest clothes for honest childhoods. Her fingers shook slightly as she adjusted a folded blanket on the table for the third time, though no one watching would have guessed. This was her first public showing. It wasn't just her designs that stood there, it was everything she had built from scraps of time and strength. She had sewn some of these pieces in the dark while holding a bottle in one hand and a needle in the other. This was her quiet rebellion. Her proof of survival. People wandered by, some pausing to touch the fabric, others glancing at the price tags and moving along. A young mother stopped to ask about sizing. A man complimented the color palette. Nothing dramatic, just small moments of connection. And then, as if summoned by some invisible cord, a woman stepped into the space. She was tall, effortlessly elegant in a tailored cream trench coat, with sharp eyes and a small notebook in hand. Grace didn't recognize her, but the surrounding vendors did. A hushed murmur traveled down the row of booths like a ripple. Someone whispered, "That's Helen Matthews. San Francisco Style Digest." Helen moved through the Earthward Threads booth with a kind of deliberate grace, picking up a piece, turning it over, studying the stitching. She didn't smile, didn't introduce herself. She simply observed. Then she looked up and asked, "Who's the designer?" Grace raised her hand slightly, her voice calm despite the thudding in her chest. "That would be me." Helen held her gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod. "It's refreshing," she said simply. Then she handed Grace a business card and walked away, leaving behind the faint trail of high-end perfume and a sense that something had shifted. The rest of the day moved in a blur. More people stopped by. A local blogger snapped a photo of Grace with her children, who had shown up with Linda in the afternoon, all four wearing matching outfits from the collection. By sunset, she had made more sales than she dared hope for, but more importantly, she'd seen something new in the eyes of those who came through: respect, curiosity, sometimes even admiration. That night, after the kids were asleep and the boxes were unloaded back into her apartment, Grace sat on the floor in her studio with a bowl of leftover pasta and her phone buzzing steadily on the side table. Messages from strangers. Comments on her photos. A tagged story showing her booth. The next morning, she woke up to an email from Style Digest. Helen Matthews had included Earthward Threads in her coverage of the Pearl Street Market. One paragraph. One photo. But it was enough. Within a week, she was answering emails from boutique owners asking for wholesale pricing. She was contacted by a sustainable parenting podcast for an interview. Orders began to trickle in, then pour. Grace added extra hours to her nights, hiring a local seamstress 2 mornings a week just to keep up with demand. Her living room became an extension of her workspace, fabric bolts leaning against the walls, patterned paper rolled into corners. But there was joy in the chaos. For the first time in years, she was building something that no one could take from her. Across town, in a sleek high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows and too much air conditioning, Nathan Caldwell leaned back in a leather chair, thumbing through the latest issue of Style Digest while waiting for a call to start. He skimmed past the usual pages, runways, influencers, capsule collections, until his eye caught on a photo that made his stomach lurch. There, in warm golden lighting, was Grace. Hair pulled into a loose bun, a soft cotton apron tied around her waist, a child on each side, 2 more behind her, all smiling under the sign Earthward Threads. The caption read, "The Soft Revolution, Grace Monroe's Sustainable Vision for Childhood." He stared at the image far longer than he intended. His assistant's voice crackled in through the intercom. Some client was ready on Zoom, but Nathan didn't move. Something twisted in his chest, not just guilt, but an ache he didn't have a name for. She looked alive, rooted. And the children, he had missed all of that. All of them. He set the magazine down, the glossy pages closing on the version of Grace he had once known. She had changed. She had grown. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan realized, so much had happened without him. It started with a simple notification. Grace was folding laundry on the couch, the television murmuring in the background, when her phone lit up. "Nathan Caldwell liked your photo." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, rereading the name as if it might morph into someone else's. It was a photo from the Pearl Street Market, the one with the kids in matching Earthward Threads outfits, all grinning in front of her booth. She hadn't thought of him in days, weeks maybe, or she had tried not to. But there he was, just a tap away, peering into her world again as if he had never left it. She didn't react. She didn't block him, but she didn't respond either. A like was harmless, a ripple, until the second wave hit. 2 days later, a letter arrived, not in her inbox but her mailbox. Thick envelope. Stamp. Official. The letterhead read, "Law Offices of Carter, Jameson and Tate." The language was polite but clinical. Mr. Nathan Caldwell respectfully requests the opportunity to establish a formal visitation schedule with his children, given recent changes in his personal circumstances and desire to engage as a responsible co-parent. Grace read it 3 times before the words began to mean anything. Her stomach twisted. He wanted to engage. After a year of silence. After disappearing before the births. After sending only a few sporadic checks. She wanted to crumple the letter, throw it across the room, but her hands were shaking too badly to do anything at all. She called Emily Rivera that same afternoon. Emily had been more than a lawyer to her. She had been a guide through the chaos of custody paperwork, early childcare legalities, even business licenses. Emily listened carefully, her voice calm and measured as always. He has the right to request contact, she explained. But the court will consider the history. His absence your full-time care. Still, if he pushes this with resources, it could escalate. That word echoed in Grace's head for the rest of the night. Escalate. Meanwhile, on the top floor of the Caldwell Group headquarters, Nathan sat across from a man who could freeze a room with a glance. Charles Caldwell, founder, chairman and self-appointed moral compass of the Caldwell legacy, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're going to destabilize everything I've built, he said, swirling a crystal glass of scotch without looking at his son. Nathan tried to argue, but Charles cut him off with the practiced hand of someone who had negotiated acquisitions larger than most small countries. You think people will respect a CEO who abandoned the family's expectations to play house with a woman who ran off to sell baby clothes? You have a responsibility. To the company. To your name. The threat wasn't loud, but it was clear. Nathan's shares, position, inheritance, none of it was secure. Not if he kept insisting on this path. Still, he didn't back down. Grace received another letter, this time less formal, suggesting a neutral public meeting for the sake of the children. She chose a Sunday. A park near the river. Open enough to feel safe, familiar enough for the kids. The morning was crisp, sunlight cutting across patches of grass where leaves had begun to gather. The twins ran ahead with sidewalk chalk, the older two tossed a ball back and forth. Grace sat on a bench, her eyes flicking to her watch, then to the street. Nathan arrived dressed down, jeans, sweater, a nervousness in his posture that she hadn't seen before. The children noticed him first. At first they hesitated, unsure. Then one of them, Jake, called out, "That's Daddy," and the others followed. They surrounded him, clinging to his arms, talking over one another. Grace stood, frozen, watching the reunion. They weren't angry. Children rarely are. They remembered him as a face from photographs and vague memories, and they accepted him with the open hearts only the very young possess. He crouched, hugging them all at once. Grace's throat tightened. She watched from a few feet away, trying to read between the lines of his gestures, the tone of his voice, the forced ease in his laugh. It all looked genuine, but she had learned long ago that sincerity could be rehearsed. What did he really want? Was this guilt? A publicity move? A long-delayed awakening? Or was it pressure, from his father, from his own ego, from somewhere deeper? After a while he glanced up and caught her eye. He didn't smile. Didn't wave. Just looked at her with something closer to apology than arrogance. She looked away. Too soon. Too uncertain. She couldn't afford the luxury of softening. Not yet. As the children pulled him toward the swings, Grace sat back down. Her tea had gone cold. In front of her, the scene looked like any other family out for a Sunday. But beneath the surface, the game had begun. And she wasn't sure yet which of them was playing to win. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with anticipation and restrained hostility. Grace sat at the long oak table beside her attorney, Emily Rivera, whose expression was carved from stone. Across from them, Nathan occupied the opposite table with his high-profile legal team, men in tailored suits who looked as though they'd rather be arguing mergers than family matters. A few rows behind them sat silent observers, court staff, clerks, and a journalist from a local legal publication whose presence was reluctantly approved. Grace could feel her heartbeat in her neck. This wasn't just about visitation anymore. It had become something else entirely, something that reeked of power, image, and legacy. The judge, a seasoned woman with steely eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, called the session to order. The legal teams wasted no time diving in. Nathan's lead counsel began with an argument built on structure and appearance. Mr. Caldwell wished to fulfill his responsibilities as a father, and had shown a sincere desire to repair past absence through meaningful involvement. He cited recent visits, financial stability, and Nathan's continued connection to his family's philanthropic efforts. Grace barely restrained herself as the lawyer portrayed Nathan as a man seeking redemption through responsible fatherhood. Emily Rose, voice calm but sharp. She recited documented absences, the lack of communication during and after pregnancy, the complete financial and emotional detachment for nearly a year. She presented medical records, school reports, even testimony from Grace's midwife. Each fact landed like a stone, and Nathan, though still composed, shifted uncomfortably under the growing weight of omission. For every polished line about renewed commitment, Emily countered with silence, abandonment, and the burden Grace had carried alone. Then the judge turned to Nathan directly. Her question was blunt. Why did you disappear from your children's lives? Not legally. Not in theory. I want the real answer. Today. Nathan hesitated. His jaw clenched. His fingers curled into the edge of the table. Finally he stood. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. I left because I was afraid. But not of fatherhood. I was afraid of my father. He looked up at Grace and then back at the judge. When Grace told me she was pregnant, for babies, I went to him. I don't know what I thought. That he'd help. That he'd guide me. Instead he gave me a choice. Leave her and the children and keep my future, or stay and lose everything. My shares. My stake in the company. My name. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's expression didn't change. But Grace's hands had gone cold. She hadn't known the full extent of it, not like this. Nathan continued. I wasn't strong enough to defy him. I convinced myself it was for the best. That money and distance would be enough. But I was wrong. There was no dramatic pause. No emotional performance. Just quiet truth delivered too late. Then, as if fate had scripted the moment, the courtroom doors opened and Charles Caldwell entered. He walked with the certainty of a man used to owning every room. His gray tailored suit was impeccable, his eyes unreadable behind thin spectacles. The judge allowed him to speak briefly after confirming his identity. Charles didn't deny his son's account. Instead he justified it. It wasn't personal, he said, as if that mattered. It was strategic. The company doesn't survive on sentiment. It survives on control. Children born outside the family's expectations complicate things. His words didn't tremble. They chilled. Grace stood slowly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recording device. Her hand didn't shake. Your Honor, I have a recording. It was made in Nathan's apartment during a visit I made last year. He left the room during a call. I was in the hallway. His father didn't know I was there. She pressed play. Charles's voice filled the room, clear and deliberate. 4 kids with a woman who isn't one of us? That's not a family. That's a liability. If he doesn't cut them off, I'll do it for him. I'll bury her little clothing venture before it even gets off the ground. Make sure her name never touches ours again. The judge leaned back slowly, her face unreadable. The courtroom was silent. No one moved. Charles's lips tightened, but he said nothing. After a moment, the judge cleared her throat and delivered her decision. Given the emotional volatility of this case, the involvement of outside parties exerting financial and psychological influence, and the presence of compelling evidence regarding coercion, this court will not issue an immediate ruling on custody. I am ordering mandatory mediation sessions under supervision, to take place over the next 60 days. A full review will follow. She stood. Court is adjourned. As the room emptied, Grace remained seated, staring straight ahead. Nathan lingered a moment, his expression unreadable, then quietly left. Emily placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. It's not over, she said softly. Grace nodded, her voice low and even. No. But it's no longer just a game. It's a reckoning. A month had passed since the courtroom had fallen silent, but for Grace Monroe, the echoes of that day still reverberated. Something had shifted, not just in the legal process but in the atmosphere of her life. The tension, though still present, had softened around the edges. Nathan kept his distance at first, respecting the court's imposed structure. But he also kept his word. He showed up. Quietly. Consistently. He arrived for scheduled park visits, brought snacks and storybooks, listened when the kids babbled about school or drawings or their favorite cartoons. He didn't try to overstep. He didn't try to impress. He just stayed. On a cool Saturday morning, Grace found herself walking hand in hand with her twins along the winding trails of Forest Park, while Nathan trailed just behind with the older 2 riding scooters ahead. The trail was blanketed in golden leaves, and the kids chased each other through the trees while Grace and Nathan navigated the strange new rhythm of co-parenting. There was laughter, real, unforced. They picnicked under a sycamore and Nathan told a silly story that had the children in stitches. Grace laughed too against her own cautious instincts. The lines between past and present were beginning to blur, in a way that felt terrifyingly human. That evening, Grace allowed something she hadn't permitted in over a year. Nathan joined them for dinner. Not just pick up or drop off. Not just 15 supervised minutes. A full meal. The children helped set the table, proud to show him where the forks belonged, whose cup was whose, what kind of jelly they liked on their toast. Grace made a vegetable stir-fry. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Warm. Familiar. Nathan fit in surprisingly well, helping Jake tie his napkin into a superhero cape, making up a rhyme to coax Maya into finishing her vegetables. Grace watched them all from across the table, something stirring in her chest she couldn't quite name. Later, after the kids had been tucked into bed with whispered stories and their favorite blankets, Grace and Nathan stood in the kitchen, finishing mugs of herbal tea. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it had weight but not burden. Nathan looked down into his cup before speaking. His voice was low, steady, more vulnerable than she remembered. He told her he didn't just want to be a visitor in their lives. He wanted to be a partner. A father. Someone who didn't only show up when summoned, but who built something every single day side by side. Grace didn't answer immediately. Her heart was a battlefield of fears and longings. But the truth was clear. Whatever they once had changed. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it was finally time to meet each other not as who they had been, but as who they had become. The following Friday, Grace agreed to dinner. Just the two of them. No children, no legal pads, no distractions. They chose a quiet little restaurant tucked behind a bookstore downtown, where soft jazz played and candles flickered on every table. Grace wore a simple forest green dress from her own collection, and Nathan came in a dark sweater and worn jacket that made him look far more approachable than the man she once knew in expensive suits. Their conversation meandered, from funny parenting moments to favorite books, to Grace's ideas for a new fall capsule collection. Midway through dessert, Nathan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, and finally told her the truth she hadn't expected. He had walked away from the company. Stepped down. Signed everything over. There had been no press release, no boardroom showdown. Just a quiet exit. Charles had resigned from the board shortly after. What followed stunned Grace. Nathan explained that his father, in a rare, broken moment, had confessed the source of his controlling behavior. Charles had lost a brother when they were boys. The family shattered in the aftermath. His father had responded with distance, power, and the belief that emotion was weakness. Charles had carried that lesson into adulthood, into fatherhood. Nathan had been his redemption project. The perfect heir to protect everything he was too scared to lose. But something had changed. The courtroom recording. The shame. The realization that in trying to protect a name, he had nearly erased his own son. Instead of rebuilding his image, Charles used his wealth to establish a foundation, quietly, discreetly, for single mothers starting businesses. He named it after his late brother. Grace was stunned into silence. She didn't know what part of her felt most impacted, the unexpected decency or the complex humanity beneath a man she had seen only as a villain. As they left the restaurant, the Portland air was cool but not biting. They walked slowly, not speaking much, but their silence was full of understanding. At her doorstep, Grace turned to Nathan, the porch light casting a soft halo behind her. She looked into his eyes, still unsure where this path would lead them, but knowing that something important had begun to mend. She smiled faintly and said, "Maybe now we can finally build a home, not just a roof over our heads." Nathan exhaled quietly. And this time he stayed. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.